Hello everyone, welcome back to Everything Swift. Today we'll be tackling Leetcode question 435 titled Non-Overlapping Intervals. We're given a parameter here named intervals that is represented by this nested integer array here, and we're supposed to return an output which is of type integer. Basically our task for today is, given this parameter here, we want to find out what is the minimum number of intervals within this nested integer array here that we can remove so that this parameter here, this nested integer array, only consists of intervals that are non-overlapping, right? So let's take a look at example 1 to get some clarity on what we're supposed to do. So intervals, which is the parameter here, is represented by 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, and 1, 3, right? So 1 and 2 interval is not overlapping to the subsequent one, which is 2 and 3. They are not overlapping. 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 is also not overlapping. But 1 and 3 and 4 is technically not overlapping, but it does overlap with the interval that we can see here, right? So how do we know whether an interval is overlapping or not, right? So if we plot it out in a visual format, so this interval here is like 1 and 2, so 1.2, and the second interval is 2.3, right? 2.3 here, and then the third interval is 3.4, but then we can see here 1 and 3. We do have some overlapping here, right? It's not overlapping with 3 and 4, but it does overlap with this 1, 2, 2, 3 here, right? And we can see the answer here is to remove 1 and 3 so that the rest can be non-overlapping. Basically, once we remove this interval, this whole entire nested intervals array only consists of intervals that are not overlapping. So basically, that's what we're supposed to do today. To find out how many intervals that we have to remove to achieve this non-overlapping format, essentially. So how do we go about doing this, right? What is the strategy that we have to use to solve this question? One thing to note that these intervals array here that we're given, they are not sorted. And this is going to be a problem because if you're going to compare the intervals like 1, 2, and 2 and 3, 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, and if we are not sorted, then how do we know that this one doesn't fall into this interval essentially, right? Um, and if we do check the interval one by one, like for example, compare this interval with this interval and this interval and this interval, basically our time complexity for this question will increase significantly, right? So we have to do it a better way. And one way that I thought of is basically just sorting these intervals input array here in ascending order by the last index. And the reason why I thought of that is because how do we define or how do we know whether an interval is overlapping is basically comparing the first value here, the starting value, with the previous last value, right? So we, from this example here, we know that 2 and 3 interval is not overlapping with 1 and 2 because the starting value, which is 2, versus the last value of the first interval is also 2. So they are not overlapping. However, if we see the starting value of 1 and we compare it with like 2, for example here, it is smaller than the last value. So this interval definitely exists between the range of 1, 2, and 2, 3, essentially, right? We compare the first value and the last value. So that's essentially the strategy. We have to somehow compare the starting value with the previous last value. And then once we identify there's an overlap, we're just going to increment a variable counter to just mark it as that is considered one of the interval that we want to remove. We don't really have to remove it from the array because we just want to know the number of it that we are going to remove, how many intervals that we are going to remove instead of the actual act of removing the interval. So I know this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm just going to demonstrate in the code and hopefully that gives you more clarity in terms of like what I just explained. So if intervals is empty, And I do this for all my videos. Most of the time, if there's a chance to exit out of this function scope here as soon as possible, I'll do it, because in a production environment, if we can get any sort of fast performance benefit, we should do it. But I think in the world of Leetcode, it's probably not necessary, but it's just a habit of mine. So I'm just going to print out here the intervals so that you guys can see the output of the sorting. And I'm going to print one after here. And here what we're going to do is I'm just going to call this intervals.sorted, and I'm going to sort it by the last value. So 0, 1 is less than 1, 1, right? So it's just going to sort all the this basically sorting this intervals output by the last value in ascending order. Sorry. Now what we're going to do is we need some form of variable to hold the counter of number of intervals that we want to remove. So I'm just going to call it as result, and that's going to be our answer. And so let me just return this first. And basically, once we are going through the loop, right, we're going to loop through this intervals array and basically compare the first value with the previous last value, right? So it's somehow once we go through the interval, the iteration, we need to update the what is the previous last value essentially, right? So we need a variable for that, and I'm just going to call it current minimum, and I'm just going to set it to integer min. And the reason for setting this instead of like setting it to 0, for example, is because integer min is basically the smallest possible value, and I know it's going to update if there's any value bigger than that, right? So let me just loop through the intervals array, and as I said, we're just going to do the comparing between the first value and the previous last value, right? So here what we're going to do is intervals of I and 0, which is the first value, right? If it is bigger and equals to the current min, basically what we want to do is update the current min to the last interval of this particular interval. If not, that means there is an overlap, right? Basically, it's saying that if, for example, we just take this intervals as an example, right? Intervals I and 0, which is 2, for example, compare it to the current min, which will update to the last interval, which is 2, right? So is it bigger and equals to this? Yes. So we just update from this 2 to 3. However, if just imagine this 2 is 1, basically is smaller than the previous one, then we know that that interval is overlapping with the previous one, and so we have to increase the number of minimum here, number of result, basically, because that is the interval that we want to remove. So just increment it, right? So just to explain again, this else block represents the situation where the intervals basically overlap with the previous one. So we have to remove that particular interval. And this one here is just checking if to see that whether there is an overlap. If not, then we just take the last value of the current interval. So for example, if we start here, basically there's no previous, so we're comparing it with integer min, and since 2 is 1 is basically bigger than integer min, because integer min is the smallest possible value, so we update current min to the last value, which is going to be 2. Then we proceed to the subsequent interval here, so we compare 2 and the current min, which is 2, right? Is it bigger than equals to? Yes, it is. 2 and 2 is the same, so we update current min to 3. So current min will now become 3, and then the process repeats itself until it finds an overlap, and then this result will be incremented, essentially to represent the intervals that we want to. So hopefully that's clear. This is basically the solution. Let me just go ahead and run this. Hopefully nothing gets wrong here. Looks good. pass all the test cases. Let me just submit these. And that's the answer. That is the solution for this question. As we can see here, the before and after, there is some sorting involved here, right? 1 2 2 3 3 4 1 3, and then it becomes 1 2 2 3 1 3 3 4, right? We're sorting based on the last value. Yeah, and this is the solution for this question. Hopefully that is helpful enough. If you find this video helpful, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me grow this channel. And please feel free to share with any other iOS or Swift developer that you know of. Thank you very much. Take care and bye bye.